Section 19 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. How Theodore Thomas Brought the People Nearer to Music. Mr. Thomas is an early riser, and as I found him one morning in his chambers in Chicago, he was preparing to leave for rehearsal. The hale old gentleman actively paced the floor while I conversed with him. "Mr. Thomas," I said, "those familiar with the events of your life consider them a lesson of encouragement for earnest and high-minded artists." "That is kind," he answered. "I should like, if you will, to have you speak of your work in building up your great orchestra in this country." "That is too long of a story. I would have to begin with my birth." "Where were you born?" I asked. "In the Kingdom of Hanover in 1835. My father was a violinist, and from him I inherited my taste, I suppose. He taught me music. When I was only 6 years old, I played the violin at public concerts." "I was not an infant prodigy." "I was not an infant prodigy, however. My father had too much wisdom to injure my chances in that way. He made me keep to my studies in a manner that did me good. I came to America in 1845. "Was the American music field crowded then?" "On the contrary, there wasn't any field to speak of. It had to be made. Music was the pastime of a few. The well-educated and fashionable classes possessed or claimed a knowledge of it. There was scarcely any music for the common people." "How did you get your start in the New York world of music?" I asked. "With 4 associates, William Mason, Joseph Mosenthal, George Motchka, and Frederick Berger. I began a series of concerts of chamber music, and for many years we conducted this modest artistic enterprise. There was much musical enthusiasm on our part, but very little reward except the pleasure we drew from our own playing. These Mason and Thomas soirees are still remembered by old-time music lovers of New York, not only for their excellence, but for the peculiar character of the audiences. They were quiet little monthly reunions, to which most of the guests came with complimentary tickets. The critics hardly ventured to intrude upon the exercises, and the newspapers gave them little notice. Beginning of the orchestra. How did you come to found your great orchestra? It was more of a growth than a full-fledged thought to begin with. It was in 1861 that I severed my connection with the opera and began to establish a genuine orchestra. I began with occasional performances, popular matinee concerts, and so on, and in a few years was able to give a series of symphony soirees at the old Irving Hall in New York. To the average person, this work of Mr. Thomas may seem to be neither difficult nor great. Yet while anyone could have collected a band in a week, to make such an orchestra as Mr. Thomas meant to have required time and patience. It was when the Philharmonic Society, after living through a great many hardships, was on the full tide of popular favor. Its concerts and rehearsals filled the Academy of Music with the flower of New York society. Powerful social influences had been won to its support, and Carl Bergman had raised its noble orchestra of 100 performers to a point of proficiency then quite unexampled in this country, and in some particulars still unsurpassed. Ladies and gentlemen who moved in the best circles hardly noticed the parallel entertainment offered in such a modest way by Mr. Thomas on the opposite end of the street. The patrons of his chamber concerts, of course, went in to see what the new orchestra was like. Professional musicians hurried to the hall with their free passes, and there were a few curious listeners besides who found in the programs a class of compositions somewhat different from those which Mr. Bergman chiefly favored, and in particular a freshness and novelty in the selections, with an inclination not yet very strongly marked toward the modern German school. Among such of the dilettanti as condescended to think of Mr. Thomas at all, There was a vague impression that his concerts were started in opposition to the Philharmonic Society, but that they were not so good and much less genteel. It is true that Mr. Thomas was surpassed at that time by Mr. Bergman's larger and older orchestra, and that he had much less than an equal share of public favor. But there was no intentional rivalry. The two men had entirely different ideas, and worked them out in perfectly original ways. It was only the artist's dismal period of struggle and neglect which every beginner must pass through. He had to meet cold and meager audiences, and the false judgment of both the critics and the people. Yet he was a singular compound of good American energy and German obstinacy, and he never lost courage. "Was it a long struggle?" I asked. "Not very long. Matters soon began to mend. The orchestra improved. The dreadful gaps in the audience soon filled up, and at the end of the year the symphony soirees, if they made no excitement in musical circles, had at least achieved a high reputation." "Was that your aim at that time?" "When I began, I was convinced there is no music too high for the popular appreciation, that no scientific education is required for the enjoyment of Beethoven. I believed that it is only necessary that a public whose taste has been vitiated by overindulgence in trifles should have time and opportunity to accustom itself to better things. The American people at large, then 1864, knew little or nothing of the great composers for the orchestra. 3 or 4 more or less complete organizations had visited the principal cities of the United States in former years, but they made little permanent impression. Julien had brought over for his monster concerts only 5 or 6 solo players, and the band was filled up with such material as he found here. The celebrated Germania Band of New York, which had first brought Mr. Bergman, famous then as the head of the New York Philharmonic Society, into notice, did some admirable work just previous to my start in New York, but it disbanded after 6 years of vicissitude, and besides, it was not a complete orchestra. "You mean," I said, as Mr. Thomas paused meditatively, "that you came at a time when there was a decided opportunity?" Music had no hold on the masses. Yes, there had been, and were then, good organizations such as the New York Philharmonic Society and the Harvard Musical Association in Boston, and a few similar organizations in various parts of the country. I mean no disparagement to their honorable labors, but in simple truth, none of them had great influence on the masses. They were pioneers of culture. They prepared the way for the modern, permanent orchestra. They were not important? No, that cannot be said. It would be the grossest ingratitude to forget what they did and have done and are still doing, or detract in the smallest degree from their well-earned fame. But from the very nature of their organization, it was inevitable that they should stand a little apart from the common crowd. To the general public, their performances were more like mysterious rites, celebrated behind closed doors in the presence of a select and unchanging company of believers. Year after year, the same 2,500 people filled the New York Academy of Music at the Philharmonic concerts, applauding the same class of masterworks and growing more and more familiar with the same standards of the strictly classical school. This was no cause for complaint. On the contrary, it was most fortunate that the reverence for the older forms of art and canons of taste were thus kept alive, and we know that little by little the culture which the Philharmonic Society diffuses through the circle of its regular subscribers spreads beyond that small company and raises the aesthetic tone of metropolitan life. But I believed then, as I believe now, that it would require generations for this little leaven to leaven the whole mass, and so I undertook to do my part in improving matters by forming an orchestra. You wanted to get nearer the people with good music. No, I wanted the people to get nearer to music. I was satisfied that the right course is to begin at the bottom instead of the top, and make the cultivation of symphonic music a popular movement. Was the idea of a popular permanent orchestra new at that time? Yes. Why was it necessary to effect a permanent orchestra? Why? Because the first step in making music popular was to raise the standard of orchestral performances and increase their frequency. Our country had never possessed a genuine orchestra. For a band of players gathered together at rare intervals for a special purpose does not deserve the name. The musician who marches at the head of a target company all the mornings and plays for a dancing party at night is out of tune with the great masters. To express the deep emotions of Beethoven, the romanticism of Schumann, or the poetry of Liszt, he ought to live in an atmosphere of art and keep not only his hand in practice, but his mind properly attempered. An orchestra, therefore, ought to be a permanent body whose members play together every day under the same conductor and devote themselves exclusively to genuine music. Nobody had yet attempted to found an orchestra of this kind in America when I began, but I believed it could be done. Working out his idea. Did you have an idea of a permanent building for your orchestra? Yes, I wanted something more than an ordinary concert room. The idea needed it. It was to be a place suitable for use at all seasons of the year. There was to be communication in summer with an open garden, and in winter it was to be a perfect auditorium. Mr. Thomas's idea went even further. It must be bright, comfortable, roomy, well ventilated, for a close and drowsy atmosphere is fatal to symphonic music. It must offer to the multitude every attraction not inconsistent with musical enjoyment. The stage must be adapted for a variety of performances, for popular summer entertainment as well as the most serious of classical concerts. There, with an uninterrupted course of entertainments night after night, the whole year round, the noblest work of all the great masters might be worthily presented. The scheme was never wholly worked out in New York, great as Mr. Thomas's fame became, but it was partially realized in the old Exposition Building in Chicago, where he afterwards gave his summer concerts, and it is still nearer reality in the present permanent Chicago Orchestra, which has the great auditorium for its home and a $50,000 annual guarantee. What were your first steps in this direction? I asked. I began with a series of al fresco entertainments in the old terrace garden in June 1866. They were all well patronized, and repeated in 1867. Then, in 1868, we removed to better quarters in Central Park Garden, and things prospered so that in 1869 I began those annual tours which are now so common. The first itinerary of this kind was not very profitable, but the young conductor fought through it. Each new session improved somewhat, but there were troubles and losses. More than once the travelers trod close upon the heels of calamity. The cost of moving from place to place was so great that the most careful management was necessary to cover expenses. They could not afford to be idle, even for a night, and the towns capable of furnishing good audiences generally wanted fun. Hence they must travel all day, and Thomas took care that the road should be smoothed with all obtainable comforts. Special cars on the railways, special attendants to look after the luggage, and lodgings at the best hotels contributed to make the tour tolerably pleasant and easy, so that the men came to their evening work fresh and smiling. They were tied up by freshets and delayed by wrecks, but their fame grew and the audiences became greater. Thomas's fame as a conductor who could guarantee constant employment permitted him to take his choice of the best players in the country, and he brought over a number of European celebrities as the public taste improved. Theodore Thomas did another wise thing. He treated New York like a provincial city, giving it a week of music once in a while as he passed through it on his travels. This excited the popular interest, and when he came to stay the next season, A brilliantly successful series of concerts was the result. At the close, a number of his admirers united in presenting him a rich silver casket holding a purse of $3,500 as a testimonial of gratitude for his services. The Brooklyn Philharmonic Society placed itself under his direction. Chicago gave him a fine invitation to attend benefit entertainments to himself, and when he came, decked the hall with abundant natural flowers, as if for the reception of a hero. He was successful financially and every other way, and from that time on, he merely added to his laurels. The chief element of his success. What, I asked of him, do you consider the chief element of your success? That is difficult to say. Perseverance, hard work, stern discipline, each had its part. You have never attempted to become rich? Pah! Do you still believe in the best music for the mass of the people? I do. My success has been with them. It was so in New York. It is so here in Chicago. Do you still work as hard as ever? I inquired. Nearly so. The training of a large orchestra never ends. The work must be gone over and over. There is always something new. And your life's pleasure lies in this? Wholly so. To render perfect music perfectly, that is enough. End of section 19.
Chapter 20 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 20. John Burroughs at Home. The Hut on the Hilltop. When I visited the hilltop retreat of John Burroughs, the distinguished writer upon nature, at West Park, New York, it was with the feeling that all success is not material, that mere dollars are nothing, and that the influential man is a successful man, whether he be rich or poor. John Burroughs is unquestionably both influential and poor. Relatively poor, being an owner of some real estate and having a modest income from copyrights. He is content, knowing when he has enough. On the wooden porch of his little bark-covered cabin I waited, one June afternoon, until he should come back from the woods and fields where he had gone for a ramble. It was so still that the sound of my rocker moving to and fro on the rough boards of the little porch seemed to shock the perfect quiet. From afar off came the plaintive cry of a wood-dove, and then all was still again. Presently the interpreter of outdoor life appeared in the distance, and, seeing a stranger at his door, hurried homeward. He was without coat or vest, and looked cool in his white outing shirt and large straw hat. After some formalities of introduction, we reached a subject which I had called to discuss, and he said, "It is not customary to interview men of my vocation concerning success." "Anyone who has made a lasting impression on the minds of his contemporaries," I began, "and influenced men and women—" "Do you refer to me?" he interrupted naively. I nodded, and he laughed. "I have not endowed a university, nor made a fortune, nor conquered an enemy in battle," he said. "And those who have done such things have not written Locusts and Wild Honey and Wake Robin." "I recognize," he said quietly, "that success is not always where people think it is. There are many ways of being successful, and I do not approve of the mistake which causes many to consider that a great fortune acquired means a great success achieved. On the contrary, our greatest men need very little money to accomplish the greatest work." I thought that anyone leading a life so wholly at variance with the ordinary ideas and customs would see success in life from a different point of view, I observed. "Money is really no object with you?" "The subject of wealth never disturbs me." "You lead a very simple life here." "Such as you see." The sight would impress anyone. So far is this disciple of nature away from the ordinary mode of the world, that his little cabin, set in the cup-shaped top of a hill, is practically bare of luxuries and the so-called comforts of life. His surroundings are of the rudest, the very rocks and bushes encroaching upon his back door. All about, the crest of the hill encircles him and shuts out the world. Only the birds of the air venture to invade his retreat from the various sides of the mountain, and there is only one approach by a straggling narrow path. In his house are no decorations but such as can be hung upon the exposed wood. The fireplace is of brick, and quite wide. The floor, rough boards scrubbed white. The ceiling, a rough array of exposed rafters, and his bed rudely constructed. Very few and very simple chairs, a plain table, and some shelves for books make the wealth of the retreat and serve for its ordinary use. Many people, I said, think that your method of living is an ideal example of the way people ought to live. There is nothing remarkable in that. A great many people are very weary of the way they think themselves compelled to live. They are mistaken in believing that the disagreeable things they find themselves doing are the things they ought to do. A great many take their ideas of a proper aim in life from what other people say and do. Consequently, they are unhappy, and an independent existence such as mine strikes them as ideal. As a matter of fact, it is very natural. Would you say that to work so as to be able to live like this should be the aim of a young man? By no means. On the contrary, his aim should be to live in such a way as will give his mind the greatest freedom and peace. This can be very often obtained by wanting less of material things and more of intellectual ones. A man who achieved such an aim would be as well off as the most distinguished man in any field. Money-getting is half a mania, and some other getting propensities are manias also. The man who gets content comes nearest to being reasonable. I should like, I said, to illustrate your point of view from the details of your own life. Students of nature do not, as a rule, have eventful lives. I was born in Roxbury, New York, in 1837. That was a time when conditions were rather primitive. My father was a farmer, and I was raised among the woods and fields. I came from an uncultivated, unreading class of society, and grew up among surroundings the least calculated to awaken the literary faculty. I have no doubt that daily contact with the woods and fields awakened my interest in the wonders of nature, and gave me a bent toward investigation in that direction. Did you begin early to make notes and write upon nature? I questioned. Not before I was 16 or 17. Earlier than that, the art of composition had anything but charms for me. I remember that while in school, at the age of 14, I was required, like other students, to write compositions at stated times, but I usually evaded the duty one way or another. On one occasion, I copied something from a comic almanac and unblushingly handed it in as my own, but the teacher detected the fraud and ordered me to produce a 12-line composition before I left school. I remember I racked my brain in vain, and the short winter day was almost closing when J. Gould, who sat in the seat behind me, wrote 12 lines of doggerel on his slate and passed it slyly over to me. I had so little taste for writing that I coolly copied that and handed it in as my own. You were friendly with Gould then? Oh yes, chummy they call it now. His father's farm was only a little away from ours, and we were fast friends, going home together every night. His view of life must have been considerably different from yours. It was. I always looked upon success as being a matter of mind, not money, but Jay wanted the material appearances. I remember that once we had a wrestling match, and as we were about even in strength, we agreed to abide by certain rules, taking what we called halts in the beginning and not breaking them until one or the other was thrown. I kept to this in the struggle, but when Jay realized that he was in danger of losing the contest, he broke the halt and threw me. When I remarked that he had broken his agreement, he only laughed and said, "I threw you, didn't I?" And to every objection I made, he made the same answer. The fact of having won was pleasing to him. It satisfied him, although it wouldn't have contented me. Did you ever talk over success in life with him? Yes, quite often. He was bent on making money, and did considerable trading among us schoolboys, sold me some of his books. I felt then that my view of life was more satisfactory to me than his would have been. I wanted to obtain a competence, and then devote myself to high thinking instead of to money-making. How did you plan to attain this end? By study. I began in my 16th or 17th year to try to express myself on paper, and when, after I had left the country school, I attended the seminary at Ashland and at Cooperstown, I often received the highest marks in composition, though only standing about the average in general scholarship. My taste ran to essays, and I picked up the great works in that field at a bookstore from time to time and filled my mind with the essay idea. I bought the whole of Dr. Johnson's works at a second-hand bookstore in New York, because on looking into them I found his essays appeared to be solid literature, which I thought was just the thing. Almost my first literary attempts were moral reflections. somewhat in the Johnsonian style. You were supporting yourself during these years? I taught 6 months and boarded round before I went to the seminary. That put $50 into my pocket, and the 50 paid my way at the seminary. Working on the farm, studying, and teaching filled up the years until 1863, when I went to Washington and found employment in the Treasury Department. You were connected with the Treasury then? Oh, yes, for nearly 9 years. I left the department in 1872 to become receiver of a bank, and subsequently for several years I performed the work of a bank examiner. I considered it only as an opportunity to earn and save up a little money on which I could retire. I managed to do that, and came back to this region, where I bought a fruit farm. I worked that into paying condition, and then gave all my time to the pursuit of the studies I like. Had you abandoned your interest in nature during your Washington life? No. I gave as much time to the study of nature and literature as I had to spare. When I was 23, I wrote an essay on expression and sent it to the Atlantic. It was so Emersonian in style, owing to my enthusiasm for Emerson at that time, that the editor thought someone was trying to palm off on him an early essay of Emerson's which he had not seen. He found that Emerson had not published any such paper, however, and printed it. Though it had not much merit, I wrote off and on for magazines. The editor in question was James Russell Lowell, who, instead of considering it without merit, often expressed afterwards the delight with which he read this contribution from an unknown hand, and the swift impression of the author's future distinction which came to him with that reading. Your successful work, then, has been in what direction? I said. In studying nature. It has all come by living close to the plants and animals of the woods and fields, and coming to understand them. There I have been successful. Men who, like myself, are deficient in self-assertion, or whose personalities are flexible and yielding, make a poor show in business. But in certain other fields, these defects become advantages. Certainly it is so in my case. I can succeed with bird or beast, for I have cultivated my ability in that direction. I can look in the eye of an ugly dog or cow and win, but with an ugly man I have less success. I consider the desire which most individuals have for the luxuries which money can buy an error of mind, he added. Those things do not mean anything except a lack of higher tastes. Such wants are not necessary wants, nor honorable wants. If you cannot get wealth with a noble purpose, it is better to abandon and get something else. Peace of mind is one of the best things to seek, and finer tastes and feelings. The man who gets these and maintains himself comfortably is much more admirable and successful than the man who gets money and neglects these. The realm of power has no fascination for me. I would rather have my seclusion in peace of mind. This log hut with its bare floors is sufficient. I am set down among the beauties of nature, and in no danger of losing the riches that are scattered all about. No one will take my walks or my brook away from me. The flowers, birds, and animals are plentifully provided. I have enough to eat and wear, and time to see how beautiful the world is, and to enjoy it. The entire world is after your money, or the things you have bought with your money. It is trying to keep them that makes them seem so precious. I live to broaden and enjoy my own life, believing that in so doing I do what is best for everyone. If I ran after birds only to write about them, I should never have written anything that anyone else would have cared to read. I must write from sympathy and love, that is, from enjoyment, or not at all. I come gradually to have a feeling that I want to write upon a given theme. Whenever the subject recurs to me, it awakens a warm personal response. My confidence that I ought to write comes from the feeling or attraction which some subjects exercise over me. The work is pleasure, and the result gives pleasure. And your work as a natural is what? Climbing trees to study birds, lying by the waterside to watch the fishes, sitting still in the grass for hours to study the insects, and tramping here and there, always to observe and study whatever is common to the woods and fields. Men think you have done a great work, I said. I have done a pleasant work, he said modestly. And the achievements of your schoolmate Gould do not appeal to you as having anything in them worth aiming for? I questioned. Not for me. I think my life is better for having escaped such vast and difficult interests. The gentle, light-hearted naturalist and recluse came down the long hillside with me to put me right on the main road. I watched him as he retraced his steps up the steep, dark path, lantern in hand. His 60 years sat lightly upon him, and as he ascended I heard him singing. Long after the light melody had died away, I saw the serene little light bobbing up and down in his hand, disappearing and reappearing, as the lone philosopher repaired to his hut and his couch of content. End of chapter 20.
Section 21 of How They Succeeded. This is a LibriVox recording. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Vreeland's romantic story. How he came to transport 1 million passengers a day. A short time ago, New York learned with interest and some astonishment that the head of its greatest transportation system, Herbert H. Vreeland, had received from several of his associates as individuals a Valentine present of $100,000 in recognition of his superb management of their properties. Many New Yorkers then learned, for the first time, what railroad experts throughout the country had long known, that the transportation of 1 million people a day in New York's busy streets, without serious friction or public annoyance, is not a matter of chance, but is the result of perhaps the most perfect traffic organization ever created, at the head of which is a man, quiet, forceful, able, with the ability of a great general, a master, and at the same time a friend of men, himself one for whom in the judgment of his associates almost any higher railroad career is possible. 30 years ago Mr. Vreeland, then a lad 13 years old, was, to use his own humorous, reminiscent phrase, "whisting ice" on the Hudson River, one of a gang of 18 or 20 men and boys filling the ice carts for retail city delivery. A picture just brought to light shows him among the force lined up to be photographed as a tall, loosely built, hatchet-faced lad in working garb, with a fragment of a smile on his face, as if he could appreciate the contrast of the boy of that day with the man of the future. How do these things happen? What was the divine spark in this boy's brain and heart that should lift him out of the crowd of the commonplace to the position of responsibility and influence in the world which he now occupies? If my readers could have been present at the interview kindly granted by Mr. Vreeland to the writer, and could have heard him recalling his early life and its many struggles and disappointments, with a smile that was often near a tear, they would have gone away feeling that nothing is impossible to him who dares, and above all else who works, and they would have derived inspiration far greater than can possibly be given in these written words. I first entered the railroad business in 1875, said Mr. Vreeland, shovelling gravel on one of the Long Island Railroad Company's night construction trains. Though this position was humble enough, it was a great thing to me then to feel myself a railroad man, with all that that term implied, and when, after a few months' trial, I was given the job of inspecting ties and roadbed at $1 a day, I felt that I was well on the road to the presidency. One day the superintendent asked my boss if he could give him a reliable man to replace a switchman who had just made a blunder leading to a collision and had been discharged. The reply was, "Well, I've got a man named Vreeland here who will do exactly what you tell him to." They called me up, and after a few short, sharp questions from the trainmaster, I went down to the dreary and desolate marsh near Bushwick, Long Island, and took charge of a switch. For a few days I had to camp out near that switch in any way that might happen, but finally the officers made up their minds that they could afford me the luxury of a 2x4 flag house with a stove in it, and I settled down for more railroading. The Bushwick station was not far away, and one of the company's division headquarters was there. I soon made the acquaintance of all the officials around that station, and got into their good graces by offering to help them out in their clerical work at any and all times when I was off duty. It was a godsend to them, and exactly what I wanted, for I had determined to get into the inside of the railroad business from bottom to top. Many's the time I have worked till 11 or 12 o'clock at night in that little station, figuring out train receipts and expenses, engine cost and duty, and freight and passenger statistics of all kinds. And as a result of this work, I quickly acquired a grasp of railroad details in all stages, which few managers possess, for in one way or another I got into and through every branch of the business. My Bushwick switch was a temporary one, put in for construction purposes only, and, after some months' use, was discontinued, and I was discharged. This did not suit me at all, and I went to one of the officials of the road and told him that I wanted to remain with the Long Island Railroad Company in any capacity whatsoever, and would be obliged to him if he would give me a job. He said at first that he hadn't a thing for me to do, but finally added, as if he was ashamed to suggest it, that, if I had a mind to go down on another division and sweep out and dust cars, I might do it. I instantly accepted, and thereby learned the details of another important railroad department. Pretty soon they made me brakeman on an early morning train to Hempstead, and then I found that I was worth to the world, after 2 years of railroad training, just $40 a month, plus a perquisite or two obtained from running a card table department in the smoking cars. I remember that I paid $18 of my munificent salary for board and lodging, sent $20 home for the support of my mother and sister, and had $2 a month and the aforesaid perquisites left for luxuries. It was about this time, thus early in my career, that I first came to be known as President Vreeland. An old codger upon the railroad, in talking to me one day, said in a bantering way, "Well, I suppose you think your fortune is made now you have become a brakeman, but let me tell you what will happen. You will be a brakeman about 4 or 5 years, and then they will make you a conductor at about $100 a month, and there you'll stick all your life if you don't get discharged." I responded rather angrily, "Do you suppose I'm going to be satisfied with remaining a conductor? I mean to be president of a railroad." "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed the man. He told the story around, and many a time thereafter the boys slyly placed the word president before my name on official instructions and packages sent to me. A conductor on one of the regular trains quarrelled one morning with the superintendent and was discharged. I was sent for and told to take out that train. This was jumping me over the heads of many of the older brakemen, and as a consequence all the brakemen on that train quit. Others were secured, however, and I ran the train regularly for a good many months. Then came an accident one day, for which the engineer and I were jointly responsible. We admitted our responsibility and were discharged. I went again to the superintendent, however, and upon a strong plea to be retained in the service, he sent me back to the ranks among the brakemen. I had no complaint to make, but accepted the consequence of my mistake. Soon after this, the control of the road passed into other hands. Many were discharged, and I was daily expecting my own blue envelope. One day I was detailed to act as brakeman on a special, which was to convey the president and directors of the road, with invited guests, on a trip over the lines. By that time I had learned the Long Island Railroad in all its branches pretty well, and in the course of the trip was called upon to answer a great many questions. The next day I received word that the superintendent wanted to see me. My heart sank within me, for summonses of this kind were ominous in those days. But I duly presented myself at the office and was asked, "Are you the good-looking brakeman who was on the special yesterday, who shows his teeth when he smiles?" I modestly replied that I was certainly on the special yesterday, and I may possibly have partly confirmed the rest, of the identification by a smile, for the superintendent, without further questioning, said, "The President wants to see you upstairs." I went up, and in due time was shown into the presence of the great man, who eyed me closely for a minute or two, and then asked me abruptly what I was doing. I told him I was breaking number 17. He said, "Take this letter to your superintendent. It contains a request that he relieve you from duty and put somebody else in your place. After he has done so, come back here." All this I did, and on my return to the President he said, "Take this letter at once to Admiral Péron of the French fleet," then lying in the harbour on a visit of courtesy to this country, "and this to General Hancock on Governor's Island. They contain invitations to each to dine with me tomorrow night at my home in Garden City with their staffs. Get their answers and, if they say yes, return at once to New York, charter a steamer, call for them tomorrow afternoon, land them at Long Island City, arrange for a special train from Long Island City to Garden City, take them there, and return them after the banquet. I leave everything in your hands. Good day." I suppose this might be considered a rather large job for a common brakeman, but I managed to get through it without disgracing myself, and apparently to the satisfaction of all concerned. For some time thereafter I was the President's special emissary on similar matters connected with the general conduct of the business, and while I did not, perhaps, learn so very much about railroading proper, I was put in positions where I learned to take responsibility and came to have confidence in myself. The control of the Long Island Railroad again changed hands, and I was again let out, this time for good, so far as that particular road was concerned, except that, within the last 2 or 3 years, I have renewed my acquaintance with it through being commissioned by a banking syndicate in New York City to make an expert examination of its plant and equipment as a preliminary to reorganization. This was in 1881, or about that time, and I soon secured a position as conductor on the New York and Northern Railroad, a little line running from 155th Street, New York City, to Yonkers. Not to go into tedious detail regarding my experience there, I may say in brief that in course of time I practically ran the road. After some years it changed hands, a thing which railways, particularly small ones, often do, and always to the great discomposure of the employees. And the new owners, including William C. Whitney, Daniel S. Lamont, Captain R. Summers Hayes, and others, went over the road one day on a special train to visit the property. As I have said, I was then practically running the road, owing to the fact that the man who held the position of general manager was not a railroad man and relied upon me to handle all details, but my actual position was only that of train master. I accompanied the party, and knowing the road thoroughly, not only physically but also statistically, was able to answer all the questions which they raised. This was the first time I had met Mr. Whitney, and I judge that I made a somewhat of favourable impression upon him, for not long after I was created general manager of the road. A few months later I received this telegram: H. Freeland. Meet me at Broadway and 7th Avenue office at 2 o'clock today. William C. Whitney. I had to take a special engine to do this, but arrived at 2 o'clock at the office of the Houston Street, West Street and Pavonia Ferry Railroad Company, which I then knew, in an indistinct sort of way, owned a small horse railway in the heart of New York. After finding that Mr. Whitney was out at lunch, I kicked my heels for a few minutes outside the gate, and then inquired of a man who was seated inside in an exceedingly comfortable chair, when Mr. Whitney and his party were expected, saying also that my name was Vreeland, and I had an appointment at 2. He replied, "Oh, are you Mr. Vreeland? Well, here is a letter for you. Mr. Whitney expected to be here at 2 o'clock, but is a little late." I took my letter and sat down again outside, thinking it might possibly contain an appointment for another hour. It was, however, an appointment of quite a different character. It read as follows: Mr. H. H. Vreeland. Dear Sir, at a meeting of the stockholders of the Houston Street, West Street and Pavonia Ferry Railroad Company, held this day, you were unanimously elected a director of the company. At a subsequent meeting of the directors, you were unanimously elected president and general manager, your duties to commence immediately. Yours truly, C. E. Warren, Secretary. By the time I had recovered from my surprise at learning that I was no longer a steam railroad, but a street railroad man, Mr. Whitney and other directors came in, and after spending about 5 minutes in introductions, they took up their hats and left, saying simply, Well, Vreeland, you are president, now run the road. I then set out to learn what kind of a toy railway it was that had come into my charge. Here Mr. Vreeland's narrative stops, for the rest of the history is well known to the people of New York, and to experts in street railroading throughout the country. The Whitney Syndicate, so called, was then in possession of a few only out of some 20 or more street railway properties in New York City, the Broadway line, however, being one of these, and by far the most valuable. With the immense financial resources of Messrs. Whitney, Widener, Elkins, and their associates, nearly all the other properties were added to the original ones owned by the syndicate, and with the magnificent organizing and executive ability of Mr. Vreeland, there has been built up in New York a street railway system which, while including less than 250 miles of track, is actually carrying more than one-half as many passengers each year as are being carried by all the steam railroads of the United States together. Mr. Vreeland's first work on coming to New York was, naturally, to familiarize himself with the transportation conditions in New York City, and to learn how to handle the peculiarly complex problems involved in street railroading. He first had to gain, also, the confidence of his men, but this is never hard for anyone who is sincerely solicitous for their welfare, and in such sympathy with their work and hardships as a man like himself must have been, with his own past history in mind. With his hand firmly on the tiller, and with his scheme of organization perfected, he was soon able to take up the larger questions of administration. To Mr. Vreeland is due the credit of initiating and rapidly extending a general free transfer system in New York, by which the public is able to ride from almost any part of the largest city in the country to any other part for a single 5-cent fare, whereas, before the consolidation, 2, 3, and sometimes 4 fares would have to be paid for the same ride. It was upon Mr. Vreeland's recommendation also, backed by that of F. S. Pearson, the well-known consulting engineer of the Whitney Syndicate, that the latter determined to adopt the underground conduit electric system in the reconstruction of the lines. At that time, this decision involved the greatest financial and technical courage, since there was but one other road of this kind in existence, and that a small tramway in an Austrian city, while previous American experience with this system had been uniformly unsuccessful. Not only in street railroading proper, but also in steam railroading, automobile work, and the electric lighting field, Mr. Vreeland possesses the absolute confidence of his associates, who rely implicitly upon his judgment, intelligence, and business acumen. The recent gift, already referred to, is one only of several which he has received from men who feel that they have made millions through his ability. Although he is not today a wealthy man, as men are counted wealthy in New York City, he is certainly well along on the road to millionairedom. Best of all, however, and what has probably satisfied him most in his life, has been the host of genuine friendships which he has made, and the strong hold which he has upon the working man. A strike of the employees of the Metropolitan Street Railway Company is absolutely impossible, so long as he remains at the head of the company's affairs, for the men know well that there will be in that position a man who is always fair, and even generous with them, bearing in mind ever his duty to his stockholders, and they know too that no injustice will be committed by any of the department heads. Any one of his 4,000 or 5,000 employees can meet him personally on a question of grievance, and is sure of being treated as a reasonable fellow man. Time and again have labour leaders sought to form an organisation of the metropolitan employees, and as often the men have said in reply, "Not while Vreeland is here. We know he will treat us fairly." In a recent address Mr. Vreeland said, "No artificial condition can ever, in my judgment, keep down a man who has health, capacity, and honesty. You can temporarily interfere with him, or make the road to the object of his ambition more difficult, but you cannot stop him. That tyranny is for ever dead, and since its death there has come a great enlightenment to the possessors of power and wealth. Instead of preventing a man from rising, there is not a concern the wide world over that is not today eagerly seeking for capable people. The great hunger of the time is for good men, strong men, men capable of assuming responsibility, and there is sharp competition for those who are available." End of section 21.
Section 22 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. How James Whitcomb Riley came to be the master of the Hoosier dialect. It is doubtful if there is in the literary world today a personage whose boyhood and young manhood can approach in romance and unusual circumstances that of the author of The Old Swimmin' Hole. All tradition was against his accomplishing anything in the world. How, indeed, said the good folks of the little town of Greenfield, Indiana, could anything be expected of a boy who cared nothing for school and deserted it at the first opportunity to take up a wandering life, thrown on his own resources? The boy's father wanted the boy to follow in his footsteps in the legal profession, and he held out alluring hopes for the possibility of scaling even greater heights than any to which he had yet attained. Better still, from the standpoint of the restless James, he took the youngster with him as he made his circuit from court to court. These excursions, for they were indeed such to the boy, sowed deep in his heart the seed of a determination to become a nomad, and it was not long until he started out as a strolling sign painter, determined upon the realization of his ideals. Oftentimes business was worse than dull, and on one occasion hunger drove him for recourse to his wits, and lo, he blossomed forth as a blind sign painter, led from place to place by little boy, and showered with sympathy and trade in such abundance that he could hardly bear the thought of the relinquishment of a pretense so ingenious and successful, entered on at first as a joke. Then came another epoch. The young man fell in with a patent medicine man, with whom he joined fortunes, and here the young Indianan, who had been scribbling more or less poetry, found a new use for his talent. For his duties in the partnership were to beguile the people with joke and song, while his co-worker plied the sales of his cure-all. There were many times when, but for his fancy, the young poet might have seen his audience dwindle rapidly away. It was while thus engaged that he had the opportunities which enabled him to master thoroughly the Hoosier dialect. When the glamour of the patent medicine career had faded somewhat, the nomadic Riley joined a band of strolling thespians, and in this brief portion of his life, after the want of players of his class, played many parts. At length he began to give a little more attention to his literary work, and later obtained a place on an Indianapolis paper where he published his first poems, and they won their author almost instant success. Why he longed to be a baker. When I drew Mr. Riley out to talk still further of those interesting days, and the strange experiences which came to him therein, the conversation finally turned on the subject of his youthful ambition. "I think my earliest remembered one," he said, "was an insatiate longing to become a baker. I don't know what prompted it, unless it were the visions of the mountains of alluring goodies, which, as they are ranged in the windows of the pastry shops, appear doubly tempting to the youth whose mother not only counsels moderation, but enforces it. Next, I imagined that I would like to become a showman of some sort. Then my shifting fancy conjured up visions of how grand it would be to work as a painter and decorate houses and fences in glowing colors. Finally, as I grew a little older, there returned my old longing to become an actor. When, however, my dreams were realized, and I became a member of a traveling theatrical company, I found that the life was full of hardships, with very little chance of rising in the world. I never had any literary ambitions whatever, so far as I can remember. I wrote primarily simply because I desired to have something to read, and could not find selections that exactly suited me. Gradually I found a demand for my little efforts springing up, and so my brother, who could write legibly, transcribed them. Persistence. At this point I asked Mr. Riley his idea of the prime requisites for success in the field of letters. "The most essential factor," he replied, "is persistence, the determination never to allow your energy or enthusiasm to be dampened by the discouragement that must inevitably come. I believe that he is richer for the battle with the world, in any vocation, who has great determination and little talent, rather than his seemingly more fortunate brother with great talent, perhaps, but little determination. As for the field of literature, I cannot but express my conviction that meteoric flights, such as have been taken in recent years by some young writers with whose names almost everybody is familiar, cannot fail to be detrimental, unless the man to whom success comes thus early and suddenly is an exceptionally even-balanced and sensible person. Many persons have spoken to me about Kipling's work, and remarked how wonderful a thing is the fact that such achievements could have been possible for a man comparatively so young. I say, not at all. What do we find when we investigate? Simply that Kipling began working on a newspaper when he was only 13 years of age, and he has been toiling ever since. So you see, even that case confirms my theory that every man must be tried in the fire, as it were. He may begin early or late, and in some cases the fight is longer than in others, but of one thing I feel sure, that there is no shortcut to permanent, self-satisfying success in literature, or anything else. 20 years of rejected manuscripts. Mr. Riley, I asked, would you mind saying something about the obstacles over which you climbed to success? I am afraid it would not be a very pleasant story, he replied. A friend came to me once, completely heartbroken, saying that his manuscripts were constantly returned, and that he was the most miserable wretch alive. I asked him how long he had been trying. 3 years, he said. My dear man, I answered, laughing, go on. Keep on trying till you have spent as many years at it as I did. As many years as you did, he exclaimed. Yes, as long as I did. What, you struggled for years? Yes, sir. Through years, through sleepless nights, through almost hopeless days. For 20 years I tried to get into one magazine. Back came my manuscripts eternally. I kept on. In the 20th year that magazine accepted one of my articles. I was not a believer in the theory that one man does a thing much easier than any other man. Continuous, unflagging effort, persistence and determination will win. Let not the man be discouraged who has these. What would you advise one to do with his constantly rejected manuscript? I asked. Put it away a while, then remodel it. Young writers make the mistake I made. What mistake? I asked. Hurrying a manuscript off before it was dry for my pen, as if the world were just waiting for that article and must have it. Now it can hardly be drawn from me with a pair of tweezers. Yes, lay it aside a while. Reread. There is a rotten spot somewhere. Perhaps it is full of hackneyed phrases, or lacks in sparkle, originality. Search, examine, rewrite, simplify, make it lucid. I am glad now that my manuscripts did come back. Presently I would discover this defect, then that. Perhaps 3 or 4 sleepless nights would show my failure to be in an unsymmetrical arrangement of the verses. See these books, he said, rapping upon the bookcase with the back of his hand. Classics. But of what do they tell? Of the things of their own day. Let us write the things of our day. Literary fields exhausted? Nonsense. If we write well enough, ours will be the classics of tomorrow. Our young Americans have, right at hand, the richest material any country ever offered. Let them be brave and work in earnest. A college education. Answering other questions, the poet said, a college education for the aspirant for literary success is, of course, an advantage, provided he does not let education foster a false culture that will lead him away from the ideals he ought to cling to. There is another thing that the young man in any artistic pursuit must have a care for, and that is to be practical. This is a practical world, and it is always ready to take advantage of this sort of people, so that one must try to cultivate a practical business sense as well as an artistic sense. We have only a few men like Rudyard Kipling and F. Hopkinson Smith who seem to combine these diverse elements of character in just the right proportions. But I believe that it is unfortunate for the happiness and peace of mind of our authors and artists and musicians that we have not more of them. Riley's popularity. Riley's poetry is popular because it goes right to the feelings of the people. He could not have written as he does but for the schooling of that wandering life, which gave him an insight into the struggles for existence among the great unnumbered multitude of his fellow men. He learned in his travels and journeys, in his hard experience, a strolling sign painter and patent medicine peddler, the Freemasonry of poverty. His poems are natural. They are those of a man who feels as he writes. As Thoreau painted nature in the woods and streams and lakes, so Riley depicts the incidents of everyday life and brightens each familiar lineament with that touch that makes all the world akin. End of chapter 22. End of How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden.